In this lesson called Science versus Blank, we will be defining science, seeing how it relates to associated concepts, and indicating how creation science truly is science. So, first, let's look at what science is. It comes from the Latin word for knowledge, so it essentially just is factual knowledge. According to Webster's 1828 dictionary, the first definition is, in a general sense, knowledge or certain knowledge, the comprehension or understanding of truth or facts by the mind. The science of God must be perfect. And so, science is knowledge about the natural or social world, especially their processes and systems derived from empirical studies. So conclusions are drawn from observation, experimentation, and or modeling. And no, I do not mean the fashion kind. So examples would be learning about gravitational forces, chemical reactions, human interactions, and political economic systems. Also, science, for something to be science, it must have a falsifiable claim, i.e. the premise must be theoretically disprovable. Something to be science, it does not have to completely neglect the existence of the supernatural or its possibility. Since all science has a supernatural origin, it isn't inherently unscientific to mention the supernatural in relation to the science of the natural or social world. Therefore, creation science claiming that scientific phenomena, such as multiple separate organism and language families, saying that such things originated from being directly created by the divine creator, and that they can be learned about through scientific study, still fits what science is. And if you haven't seen my video titled 3 Scientific Facts That Prove God's Existence, you can see it in this video description, just as a side note. What we will compare and contrast science with is science as a process, non-science, which is essentially humanities, and finally fiction. Now, let's look at science as defined as a process. It's an eventually self-correcting methodology of finding the most possible explanation and most likely accurate understanding of the natural and social world, instead of a collection of known facts. So it's not just straight factual, certain knowledge. It's a method of getting as much of that as possible, or at least as close as possible, to having it. And really, according to some, it's not at all about discovering and verifying a certain knowledge of an absolute fact. It's just getting as close as can be without ever really being truly certain if anything actually is an objective, immutable fact of reality. It's more about finding what you think reality is, not actually proving exactly what reality is and how it works. Again, according to some, not all, but many. Non-science, which as I said, is essentially what are called humanities. Their primary focus is much less on processes and systems of function, and far more on abstracts outside of, but well connected to, science. So you have your art, which is visuals and performances produced through scientific processes, like the audio physics involved in playing music that speaks a message, chemistry involved in painting, to like make the paint and the colors, and the biology, how your body works, that's involved in dance. There's also philosophy, concepts that give a basis for science, an explanation for what science cannot explain. So examples of it being like answering the questions of what's the makeup of reality? How's knowledge gained? What methods are ethical? And does the existence of anything have a purpose? And if so, what is it? So creation science is still science, it just also openly addresses non-science. Because you can't have science without philosophy. Philosophy gives you the basis of science, like in those first 2 example questions. All science addresses philosophy, whether openly or not. So creation science, though addressing philosophy, is still science. Fiction is non-factual, non-literal, not true, false reality, tale slash story slash narrative. So those three words all just mean the same thing, really. And fiction is the opposite of science, since science is about what is factual and fiction is about what is not factual. Fiction in literature can take many forms. You have a fable where you have anthropomorphized, human-formed like creatures. You have a legend, which is a traditional story of usually famous individuals or places that are wrongly viewed as provable history. You have fairy tale, which is a short story containing the supernatural, usually fictional supernatural. You have an epic, which is really just a long fairy tale. Narrative poetry, which is self-explanatory. And then myth, which is only sometimes fiction, and allegory, which is essentially always fiction, though it could technically be true. And fiction also includes anything else along these lines, like pseudoscience. Anything that is just not fact, not literal objective reality, is fiction, and therefore the opposite of science. And what we'll finish this lesson looking at is these three different forms of fiction, or just false reality. That's myth, allegory, and pseudoscience. Yeah, myth. Here are three major definitions. From Britannica, a symbolic narrative, usually of unknown origin and at least partially traditional, that ostensibly relates actual events and that is especially associated with religious belief. The first definition from dictionary.com is a traditional or legendary story, usually concerning some being or hero or event, with or without a determinable basis of fact or a natural explanation. And the first definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary is a usually traditional story of ostensibly / plausible historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. You can see there's not that much consistency in primary definitions, and religion and tradition are two of the very few things that really seem to be included in every one of the primary definitions. But as you can see, myth being guaranteed falsehood is rarely ever included in the primary definitions, and it's actually usually said to have uncertain factual validity. So something being a myth, meaning a definitely fictional thing, is merely a practical definition that's become a secondary dictionary definition. And just like a tale, it could be true or not. It doesn't have to be false. And there are many things that were once considered false myths that have actually been found to be true. Kraken turned out to be the colossal squid, and the Norse mythology, in simplest terms, essentially a invisible force field around the Earth called the Svalin, really is just the ozone layer. It kind of is an invisible force field around the Earth protecting us from intense UV. Also, Troy, Hittites, King David, all those turned out to be true. And really, almost everything God talked about to Job in the last few chapters of the book of Job, like sea vents, when it talks about, can't remember exactly, it's like heat coming up from the bottom of the ocean. Also, Christ's resurrection, that we know that's true. Don't fight me on that one. The universe coming out of nothing, aka ex nihilo creation, that's true. And really a myriad of other people, places, objects, and events in the Bible, all thought to be myths, all turned out to be true. It's like an allegory, which is a fictional narrative that's a symbolic representation of something else that's real and usually often abstract. And keep in mind, not all things that are a historical representation of something else, including narratives, are allegorical fiction. So, like, think about Jesus being called the Lamb of God, or in Latin, Agnus Dei, if you ever heard that term and didn't know what it meant. And him being called the Lion of Judah does not mean that lambs and lions don't exist. They are a literal thing that is also a symbol of something else literal. And like if I told you a story of me doing something stupid, just a narrative of me being an idiot and getting myself into trouble, that could be symbolic of your actions have consequences. I could use that as a symbolic representation of something else, even though it's a literal narrative. And when thinking about creation science isn't falsely viewing allegory as literal history, because Genesis 1 through 11, which is the very basis of creation science, it's clearly written as any other narrative is, and has no poetic elements in it at all. Creation science is about understanding how science is associated with the literal historical events in those chapters. So creation science not be denied as being science because, claiming, oh, you're trying to make what is clearly fiction reality. Nope, it is not clearly fiction. It's clearly supposed to be taken as literal history if you look at the language and literature. Now, for the final thing we'll look at for this lesson, pseudoscience, which literally means false knowledge. It is something that is claimed to be science but does not fit the definition. An idea that's been debunked but is still claimed to be true, that can't be empirically studied but is said to be so, said to be compatible with the scientific method, and or something that is an unfalsifiable claim, i.e. it's designed to not even be theoretically disprovable and set up to where there's no way you could possibly prove it false. And you see, macroevolutionary theory almost fits this. I'm willing to not go as far to say that macroevolution is completely and totally pseudoscience, but I am willing to go as far to say that it at least comes close to straddling the line. Like when it comes to Darwin's claim that, yes, not finding a full series of intermediate form fossils disproves his theory, but the only reason you can't find them is because the fossil record is so incomplete and imperfect, and those fossils would be extremely rare to find anyways. That would be like me saying you could debunk my theory that leprechauns exist by not being able to find any leprechauns, but there's no way you'd be able to find leprechauns because they're so rare and good at hiding. You can't say not being able to find something disproves your theory and then come up with an excuse that says, but there's no way you'd be able to find them. You just gotta trust me, bro, that they're out there and that's true. No. Also, macroevolutionary theory can't be observed or experimented in real time because of how long processes take. One individual cannot observe macroevolution of geological or biological phenomena. And I know when it comes to these 2 points, someone's going to say, well, what do you mean? There are tons of intermediate fossils, and we can observe them and show. Darwin just didn't know how far we'd get. No. If you really look hard at those intermediate forms, they're not intermediate forms. They're only intermediate forms if you make them intermediate forms. And I'm not trying to be a jerk, but that is fact. Also, most importantly, macroevolutionary theory has been debunked repeatedly because macroevolution violates at least 2 scientific principles. Usually 3. And if you don't believe me or just want more explanation on what I'm talking about, go look at my YouTube short lesson called 3 Principles That Make Macroevolution Impossible, and you will see what I'm talking about. And you'll see the proof in the pudding. But don't eat the pudding. I need that. But creation science is not pseudoscience because it doesn't have any unfalsifiable claims. If you could prove macroevolution, then you can disprove creation science. And creation science is about empirically studying things in the natural world. Because creation science is about empirically understanding the natural science in the world and then relating it to supernatural events in the past. It's not about trying to empirically study the supernatural, despite popular belief. And also, it hasn't been debunked because you haven't proved macroevolution. So, creation science definitely does not fit the definition of pseudoscience. You can look at the definition in just about any dictionary. Creation science does not fit it.